The power to my house cut out right as I was in the middle of prepping dinner. I'm talking half-cooked chicken sizzling in a cold pan, lights flickering, and my front yard motion lights snapping off like someone hit a switch. Which, as it turned out, someone had. See, I live in a neighborhood governed by the infamous Willow Ridge HOA, and if there's one thing they're good at, it's pretending they're above the law. And if there's one person who embodies that perfectly, it's Marlene Whitaker, HOA Vice President, self-declared community organizer, and full-time tyrant with a stacked bob haircut and a clipboard that seems surgically attached to her arm. I'm Zeke Dalton. I've lived here for 6 years. I work from home as a systems engineer, keep my yard trimmed, and mind my own business. But ever since Marlene decided my cedar fence was 2 inches too high last spring, I've been on her radar. So when the lights blinked out, I went outside and followed the line of extension cords running from my breaker box. They weren't mine. They led across my side yard, looped around the bushes, and disappeared behind Marlene's 6-foot party tent across the street. That's when it clicked. She'd hijacked my power. I marched across the street, stepping over folding chairs and dodging a table covered in catered shrimp cocktails. There were at least 30 people there, all sipping wine under strings of fairy lights powered by my electricity. "Marlene," I called. She turned, wearing a pastel pink pantsuit and a smug little expression that made my blood pressure spike. "Zeke," she said, "you didn't RSVP. I didn't know I had to RSVP for you to steal my power. You cut off my electricity." She waved her hand like I just told her the sprinklers were running too long. "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's just for a few hours. You weren't using it for anything important, were you?" I stared at her. "You broke into my panel." "I have a key," she said. "HOA protocol. Emergency access. That's not a thing." "It is now," she said and turned away like I was a waiter trying to take her plate too early. I walked back to my house, seething. I wasn't about to let this go. I dug out the generator I kept in the shed bought it 3 years ago after a winter storm knocked out half the grid. I rolled it into the garage, fired it up, and wired it through an isolation switch. Within minutes, my house was glowing again. But then I had an idea. The generator had a transfer switch, and Marlene's little setup across the street, it wasn't grounded properly. She hadn't run her cords through a surge protector. Her whole lighting rig was pulling juice straight from my stolen line. So I flipped the breaker back to the main line and waited. 30 seconds later, I heard the buzz of popping bulbs. Then darkness. The entire tent went out like someone flipped a master switch. And the best part? My house stayed lit like a Christmas tree. From across the street, I heard Marlene shout, "What happened? Why are the lights off?" I stepped onto my porch with a coffee in hand, leaned against the railing, and yelled back, "Must be an emergency. Better call the HOA." The next morning, I didn't even make it to my second cup of coffee before the doorbell started ringing like a fire alarm. I opened it to find 2 men in identical navy polos with Willow Ridge HOA compliance stitched over the pocket. They both had clipboards and identical expressions that fell somewhere between forced politeness and veiled threat. The taller one spoke first. "Mr. Dalton, we've received several complaints about last night's power incident. We're going to need to inspect your property." I leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "You're not electricians. You're not inspectors. You're 2 guys with clipboards and matching shirts. You're not stepping foot on my property without a warrant." The shorter one cleared his throat. "We are authorized by the HOA charter under Section 42. Section 42 doesn't supersede state law," I cut in. "And I'm pretty sure it doesn't give you the right to illegally access a homeowner's breaker box either." That shut them up, at least for a moment. The tall one shifted uncomfortably. "We're just trying to resolve this peacefully. You want peaceful? Quit trespassing and tell Marlene to replace every string light she blew out with her little stunt." Then I shut the door. They didn't ring again, but they didn't leave either. I watched them from the window as they took photos of my front yard, probably hoping to find something out of compliance. They even measured the distance between my mailbox and the curb like they were mapping a crime scene. By noon, a yellow notice was duct taped to my garage door. "Notice of noncompliance, unauthorized generator use, citation pending review." I took it down, scanned it, and added it to the folder I'd started keeping after last year's fence fiasco. But this time, I wasn't just collecting documents. I had something better. Security footage. After the incident, I'd reviewed my outdoor cameras. One of them captured Marlene herself walking across my yard, opening the side panel of my breaker box, and plugging in what looked like a heavy-duty power cord. She had helped a man I recognized as her nephew, Greg, who'd recently been given a made-up position on the HOA's events committee. The footage was crystal clear. And it got better. A few hours later, I got a call from Cheryl, who lived 2 blocks over. She ran the neighborhood Facebook group and had no love for the HOA ever since they tried to fine her for planting petunias in the wrong season. Zeke, just a heads up, they're saying you sabotaged the HOA event. Marlene's telling everyone you rigged your power to fry the lights. I almost laughed. She's calling it sabotage? She said you created a surge on purpose. She's drumming up support to try to push for a lien against your property. That got my attention. They can't do that over made-up violations. She's trying to call an emergency board meeting. Tonight. Perfect. By the time the sun went down, I wasn't just ready, I was loaded for bear. I printed stills from the footage, burned copies to USB drives, and prepared a short statement. I even wore a button-down shirt to look extra cooperative. The HOA met in the community clubhouse, a faux colonial building with ugly carpet and folding chairs that somehow always smelled faintly of mildew and lemon cleaner. It was packed. More than 40 homeowners showed up, curious about the drama. Marlene sat at the front table, flanked by her usual yes-men and Greg, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. As soon as I walked in, Marlene stood. "Mr. Dalton, we're glad you could join us. This meeting has been called to address a serious incident involving one of our residents tampering with public safety infrastructure. Let me stop you right there," I said, walking to the front and holding up a flash drive. "Before we get into wild accusations, I have video evidence. Multiple angles. Showing exactly what happened." She faltered. "You can't just—" "I absolutely can. This is a homeowners meeting. And I'm a homeowner." Greg looked at the screen I handed him. His face drained of color. Aunt Marlene." "Play it," I said. The footage rolled. First, Marlene and Greg sneaking across my side yard. Then her opening the breaker panel. Then plugging in the cord. Multiple homeowners started murmuring. A few gasped. Someone in the back muttered, "She really did it." Marlene tried to recover. "That footage is taken out of context. We were conducting a safety check. Does this look like a safety check?" I advanced to the clip showing her laughing while holding a glass of wine in one hand and gesturing to the extension cord with the other. "You used my power for a private party and overloaded your own setup. That's not sabotage. That's negligence." One of the board members, a man named Raj who rarely spoke up, leaned forward. "Marlene, did you access his breaker panel without consent? There are provisions in the charter for emergency access." "This wasn't an emergency," I said. "And you're not a licensed electrician." The murmurs grew into full conversation. A woman near the front turned to her neighbor. "She could have burned down his house." Another board member stood. "We need to adjourn this meeting and consult legal counsel. If what we just saw is accurate, this is serious." But I wasn't done. "Actually," I said, "I've already reported this to the county sheriff's office. Tampering with residential electrical systems is a felony, especially when it results in property damage. They're reviewing the footage now." That shut the room up completely. Marlene's face went pale. "You went to the sheriff? You broke into a locked panel and endangered my home." "Of course I did." Greg stood abruptly and walked out without a word. Marlene followed a moment later, but not before tossing her clipboard onto the table with enough force to rattle the pins. The board voted to suspend all HOA enforcement actions against me pending legal review. Raj offered to walk me out, and as we stepped into the parking lot, he said quietly, "I think this might be the beginning of the end for her." I didn't say anything, but I knew he was right. When I got home, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox. No envelope. No name. Just a line of neat cursive on a torn piece of notepad paper. "Thank you for standing up to her." I folded it and tucked it inside the folder with the rest of the evidence. The HOA had crossed a line. And for once, the neighborhood was watching. I didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't fear that kept me up, it was the flood of emails and voicemails from neighbors who had finally seen what I'd seen for years. Marlene wasn't just overstepping. She was dangerous. And now that someone had stood up to her with proof, the neighborhood was waking up. By sunrise, I'd already compiled a detailed report with time-stamped footage, copies of the HOA charter, and a full timeline of events. I submitted it to the sheriff's office's online incident portal along with a formal affidavit. I didn't just want her stopped, I wanted this on the record. At a little past 10, I got a call from Deputy Lionel Briggs. The man sounded like he'd been on the job since rotary phones were the norm, with a slow, deliberate way of speaking and a voice like gravel in a coffee can. Mr. Dalton, I reviewed your footage. This is a serious matter. We've opened a case file. Do you have time for a formal statement? I do, I said. When and where? Now. And here. He showed up 20 minutes later in a tan cruiser, parked it right in front of my house. That alone drew curtains twitching all up and down the block. He stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, with a worn leather notebook in one hand and a badge clipped to the front of his vest. We sat on my porch. I handed him a folder with all the documents I'd assembled. He flipped through it, stopping occasionally to underline something with a stubby pencil. You're saying she accessed your private panel without consent, redirected current through an unregulated extension system, and overloaded her own circuit. Everything's in the footage. She had help from her nephew. There's no ambiguity. He nodded slowly. You're right about one thing. Unauthorized access to a residential power supply falls under criminal tampering. That's a felony under county statute. He looked up. You willing to testify? Absolutely. He finished his notes, stood, and promised to return once the DA reviewed the findings. He hadn't even pulled away when a black Lexus rounded the corner and came to a sudden halt in front of my house. Marlene stepped out like she was walking onto a stage, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, a pale mint scarf fluttering in the breeze. But something had changed. Her posture wasn't stiff, it was strained. Her confidence had cracks now. She didn't approach the porch. She stood at the edge of my walkway, hands clasped in front of her. I'm here to resolve this civilly, she said. You had your chance to do that before you committed a felony. Her voice dropped, just audible over the breeze. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The board expects me to maintain standards. That event was a fundraiser. For the landscaping initiative. You mean the one where you wanted residents to donate for a new fountain outside your house? Her mouth tightened. You're turning people against me. No, I said. You did that all on your own. I'm just the guy who finally showed them the receipts. She took a step forward. If you drop the charges, the board might be willing to negotiate certain concessions for you. Fence variances, late fee forgiveness, even a temporary exemption from aesthetic reviews. I stood. You're offering bribes now? I'm offering a compromise. No. What you're offering is leverage in exchange for silence. And I don't need anything from a person who thinks stealing electricity is a fundraising strategy. She stared at me for several seconds. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement like a gavel. By early evening, the neighborhood was buzzing again. Someone had leaked the footage, likely from one of the USB drives I'd handed out at the meeting. It had made its way onto a local Facebook page called Willow Watchdogs, run by a retired postal worker named Ed. Ed didn't mince words. His caption read, HOA VP caught red-handed breaking into homeowner's power box. Criminal charges filed. Within an hour, the post had over 200 comments, most of them furious. A few people shared their own stories of Marlene's overreach. Apparently, she'd once fined a single mom for unauthorized wind chimes and threatened to tow a veteran's truck during a 4th of July barbecue for blocking community visibility. But the real nail in her coffin came the next morning. Deputy Briggs called again. We're moving forward. DA approved the charges. We're issuing a warrant for criminal trespass and tampering with utility infrastructure. We'd like you present when we serve it, to confirm the location. I agreed. That afternoon, 2 cruisers rolled up to Marlene's house. I stood across the street, flanked by a few neighbors. Cheryl was there, holding her phone like it was an Oscar-winning camera. Marlene answered the door in a gray robe and slippers. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She just stood there, arms limp at her sides, as they read her the charges and placed her in cuffs. Greg wasn't home. But the deputy mentioned he'd be questioned separately. They suspected he helped bypass the breaker lock. If proven, he could be charged with conspiracy. As they drove her away, a few people clapped. Not loudly, just enough to be heard over the rustle of the wind. The next day, the HOA board held an emergency vote. Marlene was officially suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Raj was appointed interim chair. He came by that evening with a simple message. We're done letting her run unchecked, he said. We're forming a compliance oversight subcommittee. And we want you on it. I didn't answer right away. I don't want to be the next Marlene, I said. You won't be. We're not looking for control. We're looking for balance. I agreed, on one condition, full transparency. Every fine, every citation, every complaint documented, timestamped, and reviewed by more than one person before action was taken. He nodded. Fair. Later that week, I got a certified letter from the county court. I'd been officially listed as the primary witness in the case. Trial was scheduled for the following month. The penalty for utility tampering, if convicted, included a steep fine and the potential for up to 2 years in prison. But I didn't care about the sentence. I cared that people saw it happen, that the bully behind the past 3 years of neighborhood misery finally had to answer to someone. And the best part? For the first time in a long while, I walked through Willow Ridge and people waved not out of obligation, but out of respect. The kind you earn when you don't back down, when you choose to stand your ground. When you remind them all that rules don't matter nearly as much as the truth. 3 weeks after Marlene's arrest, the neighborhood looked different. Not physically same trimmed hedges, same rows of beige houses, but something had shifted beneath the surface. For the first time in years, people were speaking freely. Morning walkers paused to chat without eyeing who might overhear. Porch lights stayed on a little longer. And the clipboard patrols? Gone. I spent the better part of that week helping Raj and 2 other board members dig through HOA records. Turned out, Marlene had left behind a disaster. Dozens of improperly filed fines, missing receipts from supposed community improvement projects, and an off-the-books agreement with a landscaping contractor who, upon being contacted, swore he'd never heard of Willow Ridge. Raj set up a temporary office in the clubhouse and invited homeowners to come forward with complaints. They did. In droves. One man showed up with a binder the size of a phone book, every letter, warning, and charge he'd received in the last 18 months. A retired nurse brought an invoice for a driveway surface violation that had mysteriously tripled after she appealed it. The worst part? Every one of those fees had been paid. That was when we found it. A private account opened under the name Willow Ridge Community Projects Fund. It wasn't listed in any official HOA documents. Yet it had over $30,000 in deposits, none of which had been recorded in the general ledger. Raj looked at the printout, jaw tight. She was funneling money. From bogus fines, I said. This isn't just mismanagement. It's fraud. We brought it to the sheriff's office that same day. Deputy Briggs didn't need convincing. He'd already been building a secondary case once the power theft made it clear Marlene's actions weren't isolated. By the end of the week, the DA had expanded the investigation. They issued subpoenas for HOA bank records, emails, and internal communications. What came back made the power theft look like a parking ticket. Marlene had been issuing citations to select homeowners, mostly the ones least likely to challenge her elderly residents, immigrants, and folks who kept to themselves. She'd inflate the fines and offer to waive part of them in exchange for direct payments to the project's fund. Some of them had even been coerced into handing over cash on their front porches, receipts scribbled on sticky notes. The worst discovery came from a resident named Felix, a quiet man who lived at the end of Birchwood Lane. He'd been told he was in violation for unauthorized roof color and warned that failure to correct it would result in daily penalties. When he couldn't afford to repaint, he received a lien notice signed not by a lawyer, but by Marlene herself, using a forged legal letterhead. She'd gone so far as to file it with the county clerk's office. That crossed a legal threshold. Forgery, coercion, financial exploitation. The county prosecutor filed formal charges: fraud, falsification of legal documents, criminal impersonation, and racketeering. The last one hit hardest. It meant Marlene hadn't just abused her role, she'd created a system to exploit it. The trial was scheduled for early fall. I was called to testify along with Felix, Raj, and 3 other residents. The courtroom was packed. Local news channels sent reporters. One even interviewed Cheryl as we waited outside on the first day. Inside, Marlene sat with 2 attorneys. Her hair was now darker, tied back in a tight bun. She didn't look at anyone. Not once. Her defense hinged on the idea that she'd misunderstood the extent of her authority as HOA vice president, that the project's fund was simply an informal donation system, that she'd only ever wanted to beautify the community. But the evidence told another story. The emails alone were damning. In one, she instructed Greg to flag homes that could be pressured into compliance. In another, she wrote, if they can't afford the fine, offer a discount for cash. No need to log it. Just send me the amount. When I took the stand, the prosecutor asked me one question. Mr. Dalton, in your opinion, was this a misunderstanding? No, I said. It was a business. And we were the product. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 7 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 4. She was also ordered to pay restitution to every resident who had paid into the fraudulent fund. The county froze her assets. Her home was seized. Greg, who struck a deal in exchange for testimony, was barred from holding any position of authority in a registered neighborhood association for life. Back in Willow Ridge, the board held a special assembly a week later. Raj stepped up to the podium, held up a thick folder, and said, "This is every complaint filed under Marlene's administration. We're voiding the ones we can't verify, and we're issuing refunds for every fine paid into the illegal fund." Applause filled the room. I didn't speak. I just watched as neighbors, people who once kept their heads down, voted to amend the HOA charter. They added term limits, transparency requirements, and most importantly, a clause that allowed homeowners to challenge fines through an independent mediator. Later that night, I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the streetlights flicker on. A few houses down, Felix was planting mums in his front yard. Cheryl waved from her car as she pulled into her driveway. Across the street, the tent that once hosted Marlene's infamous party had long been taken down. The grass still hadn't fully recovered where it stood, just a patch of dull green in a sea of healthy turf. A reminder. I heard footsteps and turned. Raj approached, hands in his pockets. "You did good, Zeke," he said. "We all did," I replied. He nodded. "But you started it. Not everyone would have stood their ground. Most people just unplug and move on." "Yeah," I said. "But sometimes the plug's the only thing keeping the lights on." He laughed, then turned to go. I watched him disappear down the sidewalk. A few days later, a small envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a gift card to a local hardware store and a printed note. It read, "For the generator that saved us." No signature. Just that. I walked it inside, pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, and sat down. Work could wait. The neighborhood didn't need saving anymore. It just needed someone to keep the lights on.